skies low. Poison is the wind that blows from the north and south and east. Whoa, mercy, mercy me. All things ain't what they used to be. No, no. Oil wasted on the oceans and upon our seas. Fish full of mercury.
You know, that song is 50 years old right now. It was released in June of 1971. And its peak of popularity was right now, 50 years ago, which is remarkable in a number of ways, including the fact that, to the best of my knowledge, nobody has written a better song. Nobody has written and recorded a better song about our environmental crises, nor have those crises abated in any significant way. If anything, we're in worse shape than ever. And I don't want to lean too much on this, but the fact that nobody's written even close to as good a song as this in 50 years about this problem, maybe a tiny, tiny bit of a signal of our inaction. I mean, there are much bigger signals, of course. We'll talk about those today. And I want to say that it would be easy and probably appropriate to do a show that was, you know, kind of doom scrolling on the radio about the subject of climate change. The report that we got earlier this month from the UN panel, the first of its kind in 8 years, was about as dark and gloomy as it could be, and was a warning that even some of our best efforts may not do much more than slightly slow down this terrifying process. However, I also don't think we function very well under those terms. So in talking about this with producer Lily Tyson, I said, you know, we've got to tell people something that they can do. I mean, there are things that really can only be fixed institutionally. Nations have to change. Multinational corporations have to change. International monitoring has to change. And the average person cannot affect that kind of stuff all that materially. But there are things, you know, there are things worth talking about and thinking about. And I don't think we're going to be very good at doing what we have to do here if we don't feel some kind of sense of empowerment to address these problems through action of our own or actions that we support. And we'll talk about all those kinds of things. We're just going to throw a bunch of ideas at you, but we do need to set the stage. I'm guessing you know pretty well what the sense of the overall tone of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report was. It was essentially updating a report or the latest report in a series that included one 8 years ago. But here to remind us a little bit of what we heard is Rebecca Leber. She is a writer for Vox. She reports on climate for Vox. Rebecca Leber, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
So you could do a much better job than I can in my fumbling way. But I mean, basically this report said, look, even if you do a lot of the things that you really should do, you're certainly, you can't turn it back, and you probably also can't full out stop it. So what were we told?
Yeah, I think you did a great job setting this up, but basically we, surprise, are not slowing down global warming. The world has warmed about a little over 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times. And to remind you of the target that world leaders set in Paris about 5 years ago was a 1.5 degree target. So we are barreling towards a world that is completely changed. So there's not much room here for wishful thinking. That was clear in this IPCC report, that we shouldn't hope for the best here, that we need drastic action. And I would correct one thing. I don't think the world is giving its best effort in tackling this crisis. Yeah. We have continued more with the same inertia of building out fossil fuel infrastructure. So that's one reason we see emissions continue to climb. So we are not taking the drastic action that scientists say are needed.
Right. I mean, not only are we not taking the drastic action, we're not even doing the monitoring that would be helpful to know how non-drastic our action is. I mean, in other words, I think it was your article that pointed out in the area of methane, the world still doesn't monitor the oil and gas industry closely enough to, for example, plug up the leakiest oil and gas facilities.
Right. One of the interesting developments that is in this latest report is looking at other greenhouse gas pollutants. So that means pollutants like methane. Normally we talk about carbon dioxide, but here methane is a very potent climate warmer, and it comes from a range of sources, from oil and gas fields to agriculture to even wetlands. And human activity has led methane to be at its highest levels in 800,000 years. So one of the things we can do here is take immediate action on methane, specifically methane leaks from oil and gas. This is something that lots of experts think is within our power to get a handle on in the next decade, and it would have a measurable impact on warming.
So we should say that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the IPCC report, I mean, it really is a kind of a measurement of the problem as opposed to a prescription for what we need to do. And you just used the term "we" too about what we could do to deal with that. And I guess that's sort of the next question that I have is, who is we? Who is going to? I mean, who are the likely sources of meaningful collective action on this?
It's a great question. I guess, we is not super clear. I think when you look at who bears responsibility for climate change, it is rich industrialized countries, specifically the US, that bears the most responsibility for causing this crisis. So while other countries are huge factors, so China and India are top polluters now, the US has a lot of accountability here to help other countries transition to a world that's changed by climate change, and also both cut its footprint and help other countries cut its footprint. So I guess starting there, that it's industrialized countries that bear the most responsibility here, that's sadly where we see the most inaction, that the US has been really stuck in this polarized landscape where it really lags behind politically and policy-wise. When you look at other parts of the world, specifically Europe has taken a lead in taking action on climate pollutants. The US still lags behind considerably.
I mean, you could sort of see some slight political cultural transformation even in the last election cycle. Both Sanders and Biden, really spoke forcefully about climate. I mean, I think there's sort of been a sense in preceding cycles that he or she who overpromises on climate change and over cautions on climate change is essentially telling a bunch of enthusiastic, delighted gluttons that they're going to have to go on a very strict diet. And that's not how you win votes, right? The American people are not terribly grown up about this stuff. They don't want to be told that the party they've been having has to be over and has to be replaced by something else. But it did seem this time around that this thing could be brought up without a tremendous political price attached to it.
Right. I think this kind of debate over whether acting on climate change significantly changes people's lives. The fact is, climate change will change lives. We're seeing this play out with disasters across the country. So it's not something we can just ignore and carry on with the party, because people are suffering in this country and around the world from those effects. But also, I think the shift we saw this election cycle, particularly from Democrats, was pitching climate change as an opportunity, something that if we take action early enough, we can create jobs. This actually could be a boon for the economy. There are other effects from tackling climate pollutants that include reducing air pollution, which causes lots of illness and premature deaths. So there is this package of benefits we actually get from taking action here. And I think this election cycle saw Democrats really capitalize on that messaging. And you really see this come through with Biden and how he talks about his infrastructure plan and kind of adopting some of the language we saw from Green New Deal advocates.
Yeah, I mean, this has been around for a long time, and the Green New Deal was the sort of crystallization of it, the really attempt to kind of put it in a package of politically understandable vocabulary. But the truth is, the United States has lost economic opportunities around the world by not, for example, being able to build to some of the stricter standards that do exist in other countries. And there is, you just look around, and if you want to stimulate the economy, you want to create more jobs and more economic activity. Boy, there's just a tremendous. I keep looking at. I have this. I wasn't even going to mention this. I think about this all the time, though. So the island of Vieques is part of Puerto Rico, and during Maria, the island of Vieques lost power, and I don't know if they've even gotten it back yet. They were on generators for years, and the island of Vieques has this huge tract of unused land, and probably mostly kind of unusable land. There was the old Navy base there. That's the reason it was used for, various kinds of shelling drills and stuff like that. It made the whole terrain very dangerous for a number of years. And I'm down in Vieques occasionally. When I look at it, I think that's a solar field. You could put up an incredible solar. They get a lot of sun in Puerto Rico. You could put up a solar field there and electrify the entire island and probably have power you could sell back to the mainland. And, it feels like we don't, maybe, Rebecca, we're starting to see those kinds of things as not only projects that would be good for the world and good for us, but maybe where somebody can make a little bit of money. That seems to be a big incentive for Americans.
Right. Climate change isn't this niche subject. Basically, we can solve our other issues or at least take some action to address inequality, poverty, suffering by also taking action on climate change. So I think all of these issues are certainly related.
Now, from those of us who do care, there is kind of a phenomenon or a syndrome, and I'm guilty of it too, that we might call the Doug Forsett syndrome. Now, in the series The Good Place, which is all about the afterlife, they talk about this person on Earth, Doug Forsett, who tried to live the most moral life, the kind of life where he would acquire and accumulate the most points that would help him have a desirable afterlife. And so one of the things he does try to do is to have the absolute lightest environmental footprint that he can. Let's hear Michael McKean playing Doug Forsett and talking to Ted Danson as an angel named Michael.
Here we go. 2 waters. Let me know if you're not happy with them. I have ice cubes if it's too warm and a koozie if it's too cold.
Oh, well, that has a interesting aftertaste. Is that from a nearby river?
Oh, no. Why take fresh water away from the beavers and the fish? No, I have my composting toilet hooked up to a water filtration system. One man's waste is another man's water, and both men are me.
At which point the 2 angels spit out the water they've been drinking. But, I think we all have a little bit of Doug Forsett in us, or those of us who care. And I think we think, well, if we go to farmers markets and maybe buy an electric car or something like that, we can make a difference. And I think the point of this show episode is you should try to make a difference and try to make a difference in other ways. But there's also a way we have to accept the fact that even being very, very strict with ourselves is probably not going to be a big enough fix.
Yeah, I love The Good Place. And I guess if I'm getting my morals from The Good Place, it's not just your individual world that is what matters. And certainly when we're talking about something as complex as climate, we're talking about institutions, we're talking about the entire economy. So what I encourage people to do here is, yes, you can take action in your personal life, like eating less meat, like driving less, like going in the farmer's market. But what I'd encourage people to do is look at how fossil fuels are part of their larger lives in society. And you can take action. There's a lot of things you can do at a community level to push for better climate solutions. So that might include electrifying school buses so they produce less pollution, or electrifying buildings and having stronger building codes that are for a cleaner climate. They could be looking at local fossil fuel projects planned. But beyond that, you can also get involved on a federal level. Right now, Congress is considering a clean electricity standard that would move the electricity sector to a cleaner sources. So There are ways to get involved and to have your opinion be heard by local representatives here. And there's basically a lot that I think to do here that is thinking beyond your own house and your own personal action. And I think when you hear from environmental journalists and experts saying individual action is not where to start, I think that's what people really mean, that we need to think more communally and as a society how to have this major shift in our fossil fuel-based economy.
And some of that also does involve, I think, creating different social norms, too. Like right now, a cool thing to be able to do is setting the pandemic aside for a moment, a cool thing to be able to do is to fly to London and go and have a good time. Now, one assessment of the environmental impact of a round-trip flight from London to New York is equivalent to 10,000 plastic water bottles. I mean, air travel is, in fact, a huge consuming and carbon emitting activity. And maybe ultimately we have to think a little bit more about, what we should value. And if one person changes, it doesn't make that big a difference. But if we change that value set, it can change as well. Well, listen, we're going to talk about some other things as we go along, but we are very grateful to have had Rebecca Leber here to set the stage for us, climate reporter for Vox. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And we'll take a break. We'll start telling you about some things people are trying or considering.
Resounding throughout the countryside, a call for action, a cry for change, all anger cast aside. We are thunder, we are lightning, together we can spark a change, steadfast as mountains, together we can make a change, together we will make a change.
That's Thomasina Levy. I sing on that cut. I mean, it's a strange thing to say if you're a radio host, but I was at the sessions. I sang on that. Anyway, so can we make a change? And what kinds of changes should we make here in the face of such danger? Here in this segment, we're going to talk about two ideas. One of them is a little bit more directed at somehow or other drawing down the current amount of carbon we're putting up into the air. And then the second thing we're going to talk about is a little bit more directed at mitigating some of the problems we've already caused using the humble oyster. But right now we're talking to David Bercovici, the co-director of the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture and a professor in Yale's Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So, it's sort of intuitive, right? If you told a kid about this problem, the kid would say, well, is there some way we could get some of the CO2 that's already in the air out of the air and put it someplace else where it wouldn't be causing so much trouble for us? It sounds like something a kid would say, but it's also something that's actually being attempted here. And it's being attempted in a number of different ways. If you want, you can sort of start out with your main area of expertise, enhanced silicate weathering, I think it's called. But I also hope we can talk about direct air capture too.
Sure. In a way, even some of the things that we're looking at with silicate weathering is direct air capture. But I guess I should iterate that a lot of people think of natural carbon capture. Probably the majority of people will think in terms of forests and soils and agriculture, which is a big part of our, remit. Also within the center is to try to explore that with a lot of the colleagues in the School of the Environment. We have a lot of the world's experts in forests and ecosystems there. And that's really important. It's kind of like a low-hanging fruit in a way, because drawing down CO2 by photosynthesis is, what nature does. That part of nature, the ecosystem does anyway. And it's probably the fastest and one of the largest fluxes, or that is drawing down CO2 through forests and soils. But it also gives it back at about the same rate. It's about 100 gigatons a year, just to give you some idea of the net drawdown, but it gives back about 100 gigatons. And just to give you an idea of what we're shooting for, you mentioned the airline industry previously. I mean, that's about a gigaton a year net. What we'd like to draw down is about 10 gigatons or tens of gigatons a year to actually have a global impact. I'm just giving you rough, orders of 10 numbers. So if you can cheat the forest just to pull off an extra 1 or 2 gigatons, that's great. But it's not always that easy, because in a way the forests and the ecosystem is a little saturated. So again, it's a low-hanging fruit because it's very effective. But you can see with the forest fires that are occurring in the Northwest and in Canada, they're also very vulnerable. So in a way, one of the things we'd probably be most interested in doing is trying to protect or especially not mow down forests in the tropics, because the tropics are probably less vulnerable to forest fires, and but they're still vulnerable to decay. But another part of the natural carbon capture that most people don't think about is this enhanced silicate weathering. And it's something that you're not used to, because of course we're used to seeing trees growing up around us, and you're not used to seeing rocks suddenly be transformed from one thing to another. But that's really what the Earth does anyway. And that's where most of the carbon on the planet is stored. I mean, 4 billion years ago, we probably looked a lot like Venus. And Venus has an atmosphere that's 90 atmospheres of CO2. And we probably had something pretty close to that, about 60 atmospheres. And all of that carbon has now been sucked out, basically scrubbed out by rocks, not actually there was no life at the time to do that. So it's mostly scrubbed out by minerals, and it exists in carbonates, limestone, chalk, the type of thing that I write with on my chalkboard, marble and travertine and things like this that make good, countertops and floors. So most of the carbon on the planet is stored that way. In fact, 99.99% of the carbon is stored that way. And only a tiny fraction is really stored in things like the whole biosphere, or even fossil fuels for that matter, and an even smaller fraction in the atmosphere. But another big reservoir of it is the oceans. It's not nearly as much as what's being held in minerals and rocks, but it's still a lot. It's much bigger than the whole biosphere and the fossil fuel reservoir combined. I don't know. I'm getting off.
No, you're doing good, and that's an amazing number that you put out there about the difference between what's stored in minerals versus the biosphere. That's incredible. So I think the word we want to zero in on right now in your area of expertise is the word enhanced,
Sure.
which is the suggestion that you could make this happen maybe a little bit more than it occurs naturally. So how do we do that?
Yeah, well, okay, the natural form that happens is, it's reasonably slow, but it's always steady. And what happens is that rain dissolves CO2 naturally, and it winds up making an acid, or carbonic acid. I mean, carbonic acid is the same stuff you're drinking when you're drinking Coke or 7-Up or soda water. And that's why we like to drink it. It's got a little acid and helps us digest stuff, like hamburgers, okay? So that acid winds up reacting with natural minerals, silicates, and that's why we call about enhanced silicate weathering. And that carbonic acid, in the end, through a few different processes, winds up converting that into carbonates like limestone, calcite, and things like that. Calcite is one of the main minerals that makes up things like limestone and dolomites and aragonites and stuff like this. And it winds up washing it into the rivers, into lakes, into the oceans, and that happens naturally. Now, the way to enhance it, there are various options for doing this. One is you could perhaps just react it with minerals that are very fast reactors, but they don't happen in huge abundance the way, for example, lava rocks do. Now, lava rocks, like the type of stuff you think of in Hawaii, spewing all over the place and making these beautiful pahoehoe flows, and they react pretty fast. And that's probably the most abundant rock on the surface of the planet. There is no limit to those. But then there are rocks that come right out of the mantle that haven't melted, and they react super fast. And so there are colleagues of mine like Columbia, Peter Kalaman, who's a world expert in this, has been promoting the idea of trying to get things like, they're called peridotites, to react quickly. But another way, one that we're looking at, is grinding up rocks. Grinding up these minerals like basalt. Basalt is lava that you think of in Hawaii. And by making them very small grain sizes, they react much more quickly. Now, it used to be thought 10 years ago, well, that's crazy because there's a lot of energy involved with actually grinding this up. But now that we're at this sort of critical moment where we actually have to really consider negative emissions, this is something that was recommended after the 2015 Paris Accord and IPCC studies that showed we're just not going to do this without negative emissions, and that's what we're doing, of course. So grinding up these minerals now is cost effective for what it is that we need to do. And there are various ways that you can distribute them. One really attractive way is to put them into agricultural settings and to sprinkle them into crops. Farmers do this anyway. By liming their fields, they try to reduce the acidity of the soil, but you can do this instead with this sort of ground up basalt. And the soils have a high concentration of CO2 in them because microbes are basically digesting sugars and putting out CO2, so through respiration. And that CO2 in the soil is a high enough concentration that it reacts with those minerals to make these carbonates. And so that's something that's been studied. People have been doing field trials of this, and we're actually looking to do more field trials of this in the US at different environments. And that's a very attractive thing because it releases nutrients for the soil, it sucks up carbon. And then another co-benefit, which we're actually almost looking to go directly to, is doing it eventually flows into the ocean, but we're even looking at trying to find ways to deposit this directly into the ocean. And by doing that, you can reduce the acidity of the ocean. I mean, we all worry about the oceans becoming highly acidic and harming coral reefs and any other shell-producing organism because of climate change. I mean, when we think about, stuff that we're spewing into the atmosphere and you think, oh, the atmosphere's got 450 parts per million, that's accounting for the fact that the ocean is sucking up a lot of that CO2 and absorbing it. But if we can help the ocean by adding some of these minerals, which reduces the acidity of it, we can get the ocean to absorb it even faster. Those minerals will eventually react with the acid to eventually create, they'll in a way promote more shell production. And
well, this is going to be very good news for the guest who's going to follow you, who's going to be talking about oysters and the specific role that they play. So the oysters are going to be very happy to hear what you're talking about. But
absolutely.
before we run out of time, I do want to talk about direct air capture, just the way that we are getting more and more accustomed to seeing wind farms on the horizon. We might we might eventually get accustomed to seeing a different kind of structure, a structure that is actually pulling air in, as I understand it, in some ways replicating what submarines and spacecrafts do, right? Basically scrubbing CO2 out of the air. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more about so-called DAC, direct air capture.
Yeah, I mean, this is a technology that's been around for a while. It uses in a way sort of a lot of the same technology that are used for scrubbing CO2 out of power plants that, you take the effluent from a power plant, CO2 exhaust basically, and you react it with these chemicals that are doused on these sort of veins, and they're called amines, and they scrub out the CO2. In a way, that was sort of the technology that's been going on for a while, is have these big, the original ideas would have something almost look like windmills, but now we're looking at things. Klaus Lochner from ASU has been the pioneer of this for 20 years or so, and looking at things called silicon trees that they hope to plant everywhere to scrub CO2 directly out of the atmosphere. It's a tough thing to do because the atmosphere's concentration, although we worry about it, it's a strong greenhouse gas. It's not that high. I mean, it's not that high that it easily reacts with things. So in a way, what we're trying to do, I don't want to sort of pivot back to what we're trying to do, but I am, is that the natural form of carbon capture using forests and oceans and minerals, in a way, we're trying to get the Earth to do what it does anyway, just faster, without trying to do anything super extraordinary by adding, another load. Well, even if you're capturing carbon with things like silicon trees and amines, you still have to store it somewhere. And so that becomes the other problem with where do you shove it? And in a way, what we're trying to do is do both of them in one shot. I mean, in other words, capture and store it naturally in the same process. So that's sort of the difference between sort of direct air capture and the natural carbon capture that we're chasing.
Right. We're going to eventually have sort of the CO2 equivalent of spent nuclear fuel rods that we'll have to store somewhere.
That's exactly right.
So just so people kind of understand this, though, there are companies that are already doing this. There are facilities that are already being structured. There's one called Carbon Engineering. That's a company. They're from British Columbia. They say, anyway, that they're going to be making facilities powered by renewable energy that will eventually each remove, on net, about 1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide a year from the atmosphere, which is impressive until you realize that 31 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide were released into the atmosphere last year, right?
Absolutely. But you have to, there is no single solution to this, and everything has to be tried. Everything's on the table. And also, I think it's really important to emphasize for your listeners that this is not the panacea to solve all things.
No.
It doesn't mean that you have to somehow forget about reducing emissions.
Right.
This is not not the last resort, but 10 years ago you would have thought of it that way. But you have to reduce emissions in addition to looking at capture, and hopefully we don't get to the point of having to do solar geoengineering.
Yes. Well, let's hope that doesn't happen, and we'll talk about it another day if it does. But David Bercovici, co-director of the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture and a professor in Yale's Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, thanks for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
All right. We're going to shift gears here. I told you we were going to release the Kraken. No, not the Kraken. We're releasing the oysters, actually, because the oysters are consider the oysters. They are here to help us. And here to explain that is Danielle Bissett, Director of Restoration for the Billion Oyster Project. Hi, welcome to our conversation.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So we should make it clear that, we just had a conversation about getting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That's not what oysters do, although oysters do filter water very admirably. But what we want to focus on here is how the oysters can help us with some trouble we've already created for ourselves. And that has to do with the kind of flooding that we're having, these large waves that accompany the kinds of storms that we didn't used to have with such intensity and frequency. And so tell us what the oysters have to do with that.
Yeah, so the oyster reefs are very similar to coral reefs. So they basically create this obstacle in the path of a wave that's coming into the shoreline. And so as oyster reefs mature and they grow and more oysters grow on top of them, they form this barrier that can help reduce that incoming wave energy, and which we can see in storm surges and just the day-to-day currents that we have that also, have big erosion issues for vulnerable shorelines. And so as these oyster reefs are placed along these vulnerable shorelines that are, either have wetland retreat or some type of vulnerable infrastructure, whether it be, power plants or wastewater treatment facilities or neighborhoods, these oyster reefs can reduce that incoming wave energy and break it up so that when the waves do actually hit the shoreline, they do less damage. So it is one tool in our toolbox to address this, issue that's coming out of more exacerbated from climate change.
Right. And what we're also doing, if we can get these oysters back where they used to be, is essentially that. Restore something that was there before. I mean, New York Harbor, I just watched a little while ago the documentary series High on the Hog, and there's a whole section about oysters in New York and the whole history of that. But there used to be, as I understand it, a lot more oysters around to protect New York.
Yes, exactly. Before Europeans colonized this area, there were probably trillions of oysters, 200,000 acres of oyster reef throughout New York Harbor. New York Harbor was very different, too, than what it looks like today. It's, a major port today. The regulatory agencies dredge to make room for these massive cargo ships coming in and out. And so it's a very different environment today and different ecosystem today. So we can't fully restore. Sorry, there's a helicopter going over my head. We can't fully restore what was once here, but we can at least restore the function that oyster reefs provide, which is what you said earlier. They do filter water as individuals. They can, as an adult, filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. As a collective, reef, they can, help reduce storm surge and that daily erosion issue. And also as a reef, they can provide, essential, habitat to many other marine species that depend on them. And because they were so prominent, back in the 1600s and before that, they were basically coined, the keystone species of the New York Harbor marine environment, because there were just so many of them, and they provided this habitat that they created themselves. So they're typically referred to as ecosystem engineers. So so that habitat is essential. Yeah.
So we're going to do a little bit of engineering for them. I say we, I don't mean me. But there is something called through the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. You see these storms like Irene and Sandy, and they get people's attention. Finally, they are implementing a coastal green infrastructure through something called the Living Breakwaters Project. So explain what this is. This kind of mimics the kind of reef system that probably did exist in the time you're talking about.
Yeah, so the Living Breakwaters Project is not just a typical breakwaters like has been seen around the world. It's a bit more natural. And so what we're actually, we're one component of that project. We're actually putting oysters on and around the Living There's about 8 breakwaters, and we're going to add oysters to them. They're made of, rocks and massive boulders. And so they are strategically placed based on modeling and wave energy to protect that southern shoreline of Staten Island that's exposed to the bite of the Atlantic Ocean.
All right. So, it's a small thing, but it's an important thing. And it may also be a model for what other places can do. And it uses a living creature instead of artificial materials that further deplete our resources. So it all sounds extremely appealing. Danielle Bissett, Director of Restoration for the Billion Oyster Project. You can go online. You can find out more about the Billion Oyster Project and possibly even decide that you need to support it. And thanks for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
All right. We've got one more thing that we want to talk about. We want to talk about the idea of granting legal personhood to bodies of water and what that would mean. We'll do that on the other side of this.
And they say it gets colder. You're bundled up now, wait till you get older. But the media men beg to differ, judging by the hole in the satellite picture. The ice we skate is getting pretty thin. The water's getting warm, so you might as well swim. My world's on fire, how about yours? That's the way I like it, and I'll never get bored. Hey now, you're an all-star. Get your game on, go play. Hey now, you're a rock star. Get the show on, get paid.
All right, so it's time to say some thank yous, starting with Kat Pastor. She's the technical producer of this show every day, except the other day when she wasn't, but basically every day. And she always does a great job and inspires confidence in me. So thanks to her. Lily Tyson, Whiz Kid producer, is the producer of this episode and has done a marvelous job as usual, except that she did pick out that Smash Mouth song. But young people, they make mistakes, and they learn from those mistakes. I think that's the important thing here. Not that we played Smash Mouth, but that we're going to learn from playing Smash Mouth. All right, we're going to move on here. We are, if you're just kind of tuning in here, we're talking about, look, when that climate report came out, when the latest IPCC report came out, I think anybody paying any attention and just absorbing it was kind of, just encircled in a kind of darkness. The vision sketched out there is terrifying, and a lot of it is now inevitable. But that's not a good place to stay, ultimately. Ultimately, we want to be able to say, what can we be doing? If we all did one little thing, it probably wouldn't make that big a difference. But if we all did 10 little things and then collected together and did hundreds of other things and began to create a different set of attitudes, some of it is our minds. Our minds have to be transformed. They have to be changed. We have to think differently about the world that we live in. And that's where this next guest comes in and the next conversation comes in. Kelsey Leonard is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Waters, Climate and Sustainability, and a citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. She joins us now to talk about why lakes and rivers should have the same rights as humans. Hi, welcome to our show.
Hey, hello. It's great to be with you today.
So walk us through the argument here. By the way, we should say that if you feel as though we didn't cover everything about this, there is a Kelsey Leonard TED Talk, which you may also want to watch as well. But walk us through the basic premise here.
Yes, well, really right now we're seeing an emerging area of the law, and it's known as Earth law. It's sometimes referred to as well as ecocentric law. And this emerging body of law is geared towards protecting, restoring, and stabilizing the functional interdependency of Earth's life and its life support systems. So when we think about our current and really pressing climate crisis and what some of your other guests have shared with listeners today, we not only need to adapt our scientific innovations to address these climatic changes, but we also need to adapt and address our legal systems to address these climatic changes. And that's where Earth law comes in.
So within Earth law, there is this concept that I think collectively is often referred to as environmental personhood. What is meant by that?
Yes. So if we think of Earth law as a tree and a canopy of a tree, there are different types of legal mechanisms that can be deployed to advance or enforce Earth law. Some of those mechanisms include rights of nature, or also within that, the recognition of legal personality of a natural entity. But it also encompasses rights and laws around ecocide, animal rights, rights of future generations, as we've seen in the Juliana case, where young American youth were fighting for their right to a future existence on our planet in light of climate change. And it also encompasses Indigenous law, human environmental rights, things around atmospheric trust litigation, as well as the guardianship of nature. So I think what's really important for listeners to realize when we think about Earth law, when we think about environmental personhood, is it's actually much more expansive than just a grant of legal personality to a natural entity. Rather, it's really, as human beings and as a society, recognizing that nature already has inherent rights to exist on this planet. And in many ways, it had those rights before we came into existence, if we think sort of about evolutionary history. So that's a little bit for folks to think about in terms of Earth law, is it's much more all-encompassing than just recognition of the personality of a natural entity, although that is a good and needed legal mechanism for a step forward.
Yeah, but let's talk some more about that legal mechanism. We should say that one of the entities that's been most involved in this is something called the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, CELDF. And what they do in some situations is, in fact, to pursue on behalf of a lake or a river, whether it's Lake Erie or some major river, to sue on their behalf, essentially to assert the personhood, just the same way that corporations and Citizens United asserted their personhood, assert the personhood of this body of water, and then I think essentially as guardian, seeking legal standing as guardian of that entity, file a litigation. Maybe you can say more and say it more coherently than I just did.
Well, that was actually a really, really, really great synopsis of what is going on and what's sort of the emerging area of this law and what it looks like in practice. But there are a few organizations out there that are working to create really what we need is a new generation of Earth lawyers and lawyers who are fighting for the best interests of the planet and rights of nature. And so CELDF, the Community Environmental Defense League Fund that you mentioned earlier, are great advocates in this space and also help to advance the Lake Erie Bill of Rights that came out of the city of Toledo. But there's also the Earth Law Center, which also works in this space and has been working with tribal nations as well as communities across the United States and globally, also in Latin America and Oceania, to put forward these different types of legal mechanisms. And then there's also the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature, GARN. And even the UN has been working in this space through the UN Harmony with Nature project. So it is a very international emerging area of law. But as you said, let's take it a step down. What does this actually look like in practice? Well, in practice, it's creating mechanisms, frameworks, policies, legislation, legal initiatives where we can actually give nature a voice. Sometimes that's through guardianship bodies, sometimes it's through different forms of political representation, but it's really saying in sort of opposition to our current status quo that rights of nature should be considered in all decision making. And so we see the recognition of the rights of a river. We see the recognition of rights of mountains. We see the recognition of particular natural entities like the White Earth Ojibwe Nation recognize the rights of Minoman, which is wild rice. And so there are some really interesting ways in which this is being advanced locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally.
Yeah, I mean, internationally, we should say something about this, too, that it's been a pretty interesting phenomenon in New Zealand, Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, and in a lot of those places, just as in the United States and in a way that you just alluded to, there's a way in which the natural rights, the personhood rights of a major lake or a river or wild rice seem to go hand in hand with some of the concerns of indigenous peoples. And this is true not only in the United States, but I mean, the Maori in New Zealand have kind of linked themselves to this issue of a river having its own personhood and its own rights. Maybe you can say more.
Yes, so this is a global movement. It includes constitutional amendments. We're seeing that at nation state levels, but also some of the green amendments that are going through many of the states across America right now, like New York has a green amendment it's exploring. So it can go through constitutional amendments. It can happen in court decisions. It can happen through local ordinances. And then, as you mentioned, through indigenous law and indigenous governance mechanisms, whereby rights of nature or the inherent rights of a natural entity are recognized and codified within those indigenous legal systems. In the context of the Whanganui River, which you mentioned earlier in Aotearoa, New Zealand, for the Maori that were a part of the recognition of that status, it was actually a collaborative opportunity between the Maori and the government of New Zealand. And so it really establishes and represents a best practice of a co-governance arrangement that is also grounded in an indigenous treaty.
Right. I was going to say that as governments begin to acknowledge and redress problems related to indigenous people, as those people acquire more traction within the legal system, they have maybe a chance to spread that traction over to some of these bodies of water and other natural assets. We forgot to mention in India, the Ganges and Yamuna rivers are, as I understand it now, considered legal persons in the same kind of effort, right, to try to fight the pollution there.
In a similar effort, yes. Unfortunately, it has been somewhat struck down by the courts in India, and so it's still under consistent litigation. But what is notable is the effort there, and it was an effort to actually recognize a long-standing societal practice based within the indigenous traditions within India that actually recognizes those rivers as living entities, but through processes of colonization and other activities of usurpation, those ideologies had been removed from the decision-making process. So I often caution folks that Earth law and this movement is an opportunity to democratize water governance, to ensure that the people in power making decisions about water and for water are actually those who are most impacted, and so that we can actually ensure that there is equal distribution of benefits, not only for us as humans, but for the water itself.
All right, we're going to have to stop there, Kelsey, Leonard, but there are some things I would like to talk to you about in the future, even some things that have happened right around here where I'm sitting. But there'll have to be conversations for another day. Assistant professor in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Waters, Climate, and Sustainability, and a citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Tabutni, thank you for having me.
And thanks to Lily Tyson. Again, all is forgiven with a smash mouth. You know, I mean, you got to play Smash Mouth once in a while. And thanks for listening. I hope we gave you a little bit of hope or something to cling to. You pick your own things and try to make them important. I'm actually changing my dog's dog food. I'm serious. You shouldn't be feeding your dog beef and lamb. Make them eat turkey and chicken.